Welcome back. And we're starting chapter 9 is our focus on the skills system. And we'll talk a little bit about the abilities in context of the skills system where some of the abilities will unlock via skills. So without further ado, let's jump into chapter 9 and talk about our skill system. First, let's talk about a couple of the sample skills that you might be thinking about from sort of popular deployments of skills in games. I've just categorized them here in a couple of different groups. They're by no means meant to be fully exhaustive list, but more a representative list of some of the things that we can enable in the system. So in the first category, the damage dealing would be things like enabling a skill to increase your base damage so you do more damage per shot in the Lyra case, or it could be through melee, but primarily we're still a range-based system. Applying sort of effects over time that might apply on hit, so that being either a bleed, a slow, or a poison, are all just different derivatives of a damage over time or an effect over time upon hit. Moving into the center column, you may have examples where you want to grant a player an extra weapon shot to give them an advantage of carrying 4 weapons instead of 3 weapons, and thereby choosing to spend a skill point there might increase their optionality in what weapons they can use. You could also spend a skill point to carry more spare ammo, so you would have more ammo, or reload faster. Those are all examples of sort of weapon improvement uses of a skill system. On the right-hand side, you could look at the notion of damage mitigation, increasing your overall survivability by increasing either your base health, increasing your chance to sort of dodge all damage altogether. Maybe you have some sort of a shield absorption system where you can take partial damage away through a shield. And then an example where you might regenerate health over time. So all the top 3 are really just variations on attributes and or gameplay effects. The other things that we thought of is the new abilities, where we might learn a new ability by spending a skill point into a skill tree or improve the functionality of an ability over time. So the sort of new ability or new gameplay style skills is also a category. And then there might be a category around sort of quality of life, right? So can you gather resources faster with less time on the gather? Can you maybe increase your rarity chances when you're gathering, that you get more sort of crits of rare resources, or that could apply to crafting as well. Or maybe you just increase your stack sizes so that you can carry more stacks, or you can do a variance of this on weight where you're able to carry more weight by spending skill points into a skill tree. So these are just some general basic examples of some sample skills. For the rest of the video, we're going to talk a little bit about this first base deployment of skills and abilities. And in the upper right-hand block, we just show our basic simple skill tree. So like most skill trees, we're looking at tiers that unlock other tiers of skills, and you can make this as complicated as you want. But for demonstration purposes today, we're going to keep kind of a simple model where my first skill is this damage boost skill, where when I spend a single skill point into damage boost, it will unlock skills 2 and skills 3. And so I can have a scenario where the more I spend into different categories, the more things I can unlock. Right, and so 1 skill point in skill 1 unlocks the option for either our regenerating health, or I can choose my bleed damage over time. The second tier costs us 2 points, so activating this costs 1 point, activating this costs 2 points. Skill 2 can activate skill 4, and 2 and 3 together can activate skill 6. And then skill 3 could activate skill 5. So if I had 5 or 6 points, I'd have to make different choices, right? So actually this should have been 6. It should have been 1 for here, 2, 2, and then being able to do this. The point is, if you have limited skill points, you force the player to make different choices in the tree and choose different aspects. So all of the skills and the abilities are all based on the gameplay ability system. And there's lots of tutorials on the gameplay ability system in general. You basically have your abilities, things that your actor can do. We showed some videos on crafting up an ability earlier. Gameplay effects, these are things that are done to or applied to an actor. So you have your damage over times, etc. Things that are happening to an actor would be a gameplay effect. We've used the gameplay queue for the visual effects. These are the particle systems and various visual elements, either UI or in-world, that signal the player that something has occurred. And then over on the right-hand side are really kind of the backbone for the system, right? So there's this notion of an attribute set where things like your health, your damage, maybe if you have a dodge percentage or other attributes that are commonly associated with your character, those tend to live in an attribute set. And so gameplay effects typically have modifiers on the attribute sets that you define for your game. Then we have, and we've used these heavily so far, our gameplay tags, which really can denote different states or conditions that are happening throughout the game. And so we define those via tags. And then there's a notion of a gameplay task, which is a block of code that can be executed asynchronously over many frames. The delay wait node is an example of an asynchronous task that you can ask inside an ability to run. So those 6 elements are the basis. There is also the note that, so all of our skills have a gameplay effect. Those gameplay effects can in fact grant new gameplay abilities to the player. But what we found was in attempting to use that native capabilities, we ran into some difficulties in enabling and disabling gameplay abilities and in the various iterations of resetting the skill tree and re-enabling the abilities. It got a little complex. So we stepped back and did a different design, and we're not actually using the skill or the gameplay effect granting the ability, except for in one scenario, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So that's kind of how we've got it set up for this demonstration. Our skill points are leaning on our item definitions, just like all of our other videos, right? The Lyra inventory system is kind of the heart and soul of all these other subsystems. And the case of a skill point is we're classifying it as a currency. So it's no different than an in-game currency, gold, silver, or bronze, a premium currency that you might spend in the marketplace. It's a currency that you could spend. In our case, we're not showing it in the inventory, so we've turned off the show item in inventory. We've given it the fragment currency so that we can identify it as a currency. And then, of course, we're using our item stack and max stack. So the stack count is how many points you have available to you. And the max stack would just be if you wanted to constrain the number of skill points a player could ever get up to. So it's very similar to all the rest of the inventory items in that it's defined in the item definition table. We also assign on startup through the initial inventory on the player. They get the skill point and they get the skills by default. So the skills are given to the player as items in their inventory. They are not shown in the inventory, so you don't see them in the UI through the inventory. And they're given the skill point, which is also not shown in the inventory system, but are nonetheless in the inventory behind the scenes. And so that allows us to interact and carry that data around with the player. For the actual skill definition, we have a couple of things, right? So as I said earlier, the upper right-hand quadrant, we simply turn it off, visibility inside of the inventory so that you don't see it. In the core skill definition, on the left-hand side, you'll see the point cost, sort of what does it cost for me to unlock this skill. Any prerequisites, and in this example, I have no prereqs, so this is my first skill in the chain. What does it unlock? What are the next sort of steps in the chain? And so here I unlock skill 2 and skill 3. We have a placeholder for a video asset that might play a demonstration of how the skill is used in game as sort of a tutorial of how that might be. Then the gameplay effect, which is applied to the player whenever the skill is unlocked. And so the gameplay effects, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes, get applied to the player, and that indicates that the player has that skill up and running. And then we have a removal tag, which allows us to remove the gameplay effects. And it gives us a little bit of flexibility to remove sort of all skill control tags, only skill 1, etc. So that's the definition of the actual skill. The only other element is in the set stats. We have our 3 traditional item definitions of the stat count, max stat, and in storage. Although those won't be applicable to skills, we still like to have them on all the items so that we don't have to check if they're missing. We've added a new element at the bottom, which is basically a binary on or off whether this skill is activated. And so that helps us when we get to our persistence layer, where we'll be storing in the persistence data model what skills were unlocked in the last sessions, and therefore what skills have to be applied upon startup to the next session. So that's a bit brief overview of how the skills are defined in the item definition. So what elements are needed to build out the skills system? So, well, the first we need is our UI interface. And we spent a lot of time in the crafting tutorial on the UI. So we're not going to spend a lot of time here on the tutorial UI aspects of it. We have a very simple UI just for showing the video. But you can spend a lot of time on your user interface and the way you set up your skill tree and all the visual elements of that, which are very game specific. We needed sort of 4 gameplay abilities that would manage the system. The first one is to grant us new skill points. So at various points in the game, either you level up, you hit a milestone, you're granted a skill point. And so this just increases your skill points available to be spent. It's a very simple ability, and we fire that off. The next 2 work together, the add skill and remove skill. They would apply the gameplay effect to the player. They would issue any items that are going to be granted as a result of this skill being added. And then they're going to take away the required skill points. The remove is the reverse. They take off the tags, they remove the items, and then they return the skill points. And then we have a reset, which just basically loops through and removes all skills and refunds all points. So the notion of being able to reset your skill tree. On the right-hand side are the 6 skills that we have set up in the system for now. So our first skill, which we're going to look at in a minute, is a stat adjustment to base damage. So we take your base damage and we add 10%. And so as you're playing in the game, if you have this skill activated, you'll do more damage per shot. We have a bleed, which applies a bleed over time to anyone you hit, sort of further increasing your damage dealing capabilities. We have an out of combat health regeneration, which basically auto executes a looping ability, listening for damage and out of combat, and then being able to regenerate your health. We'll talk about that one in a few bit. And then the last 3 are granting abilities. So the 2 abilities, Meteor and Burst, that we showed in the previous videos under abilities in the other chapter. And then a 6th one we just call Team Heal for now, as sort of a kind of game-changing, heal your entire team up ability if you choose to spec into that. So let's take a look at the first one. So the first one is probably the easiest. The gameplay effect is set to a duration of infinite, so it's sort of always on once you activate it. It's taking the base damage from the attribute set, the Lyra combat attribute set, and it's multiplying it by 1.1. So it's basically increasing it by 10%. And that's all you have to do to apply a 10% damage bonus. So it's a very simple and basic skill point, and it sort of instantaneously impacts the way you play the game. So you know what? Let's actually spec into that one. All right, so in game, as we come in, first let's attack without the skill activated. 18. 18. We activate our skill window, and we are going to activate our damage boost. So we select damage boost, it turns green. So we've activated that skill. Now if I fire, it's 20. So it's 10% higher than 20. Quite simple. Probably the easiest example of an unlocked skill that increases damage. Our second skill, a bit more complicated. We're going to be applying a bleed. Now, in order to do this one, there's a couple of pieces that have to be dealt with. First of all, it's also duration infinite. So as soon as I activate this skill, it's on my character permanently. But the only thing it does is apply a tag on the player. So the first tag you see here, skill control skill 2, is there so we can remove the effect. So there's a node called remove gameplay effect from owner with asset tag. That is the one that ties to the gameplay effect asset tags. Those don't affect your player at all. They exist on the gameplay effect, not on the player. The next block down, the granted tags, are added to the player, and therefore that is the tag that we apply to the player to know that the source of the damage has this skill unlocked. So this doesn't actually apply the bleed. It simply indicates that the player that did the damage has that skill activated. So now we have to inject that logic into the Lyra damage game flow. And this is a case where arguably we should create our own damage dealing gameplay effects. These are the gameplay effects that are in the base project, and so it would violate our rule to modifying the base program. But for now, we're just going to make this adjustment here, and then later we'll come back and do it more appropriately as we industrialize the whole system. But in the content gameplay effects damage folder, you will see the parent class, which is the parent class for all of their damage dealing gameplay effects. They have an instant, a periodic, and a set by color. What we did is created a child of periodic and called it bleed. So this is a new gameplay effect that's added to this folder by simply making a child of the periodic gameplay damage effect, which is a child of the parent. In the parent, all of the definition is the same. The only thing we add is that in the conditional gameplay effects, and it's important to note that there is a conditional gameplay effects related to the Lyra damage execution block, and then there's one that's outdented, and that's the one you want to use. If this one was not triggering, only this one triggers. So the conditional gameplay effect says that if the source has this particular tag, which is what our skill gives the source player, then apply this effect class to the target, basically. So if the source of damage has this tag, go ahead and not only do whatever it says up here, but go ahead and add this bleed on top of that. So finally, the actual bleed effect itself, it has a duration. So it's not infinite, unlike the skills. This gameplay effect has a duration. The total duration is 5 seconds. It is using the basic game damage execution calculation class from Lyra. It's applying 2 points of damage every 1 second. So it will tick for 5 seconds, tick every second, apply 2 damage. And so let's see those two in effect at the same time. So back into our game. We're going to call up our skill tree. We're going to spend a point here, spend a point here. Notice that it unlocked the next one in the chain. And now we should be able to not only do 20 damage, but bleed as well. So as we get in range so I don't miss, you're going to get, oh, that's exactly what I didn't need to have happen. All right. First shot's 20, and you can't see the ticket. All right, let's do it this way. 20. Well, that's unfortunate. No, it was working earlier. No, instead, why don't we do some gameplay debugging? So we're going to call up the gameplay debugger UI. Which is show debug ability system. And that brings up the debugging information. The first page is about what abilities I have. And we actually want the effects. So we're going to call up show next category. All right, and on show next category, if you look closely, skill 1 and skill 2 have been applied. And so therefore I have the tag to bleed, which means that the skill did its job and granted me the tag. But when I do damage, the tag is not being factored into the dealing of the damage. So now I can press page up or down, and you'll see the box move to our target. Our target does not have skill 1 or skill 2 gameplay effects applied. And when we shoot them, they have the bleed being applied. So what we can do is slow-mo that. Let's slow-mo it to 0.5. And so what that's telling me is the gameplay cue is not happening. Even though they are bleeding, we're not seeing the visual. So when I fire, you'll see in the upper left quadrant a countdown of the 5-second gameplay effect and then it being removed, the bleed. You see it counting down, 2 seconds, and then 0, and the tag is removed. So it's actually happening, it's just not visually queuing on the screen, so I need to bug that. So there he goes, and he's down. All right. So the third skill that we put together is this regenerate health out of combat. This one is applied infinitely. The difference is instead of modifying a stat or applying a tag, in this case, we're granting a ability called regenerate health. And that ability, if you look to the right-hand side of the screen, is set to activate upon spawn. So as soon as the ability is granted from the gameplay effect, it will automatically initiate and activate. We have it set to 1 instance per actor. The server does not respect the client's ability to cancel. And we said, net policy server only. So this is only running on the server because we're changing a player's health. We don't want that to occur on the client. We rather that interact only on the server. And then the result of the changed health is then replicated to the client. So that one, what we'll need to do is jump back over here. and change our editor preference because we're going to need to take some damage. Oh, it came up off screen, but I'm basically going to allow the bot to attack me now. And so he's not just going to stand there and take the damage from me. And we're going to quickly spec into to our health, so our regen health. So as I'm taking damage, I'm not regenerating health. But if I get 5 seconds without being hit, you'll see the health bar start to tick back up, and there I'm back to full health. And let's go take some more damage. Ooh, crit's hit. Come on, dude. Focus it on. All right, damage. Okay, death. All right, well, this tests that the skills actually persist through death. So I should take some damage. Maybe not be as aggressive this time. 5 seconds of out of combat, and I heal back up. So let's look at how that gameplay ability is built. We go into our abilities, we go into our regen, and we have 3 assets. The regen ability that is granted upon getting the skill point. We've got a curve, and then we have a gameplay effect to actually change our health. So let's start with gameplay effect. That's popped up on another screen. Take that over here. So the gameplay effect has a duration. We have it run for 6 seconds because about 5 seconds would heal us up from 0 to 100. Therefore, we don't need to have it running any longer than 6 seconds. We are applying starting at 2 health and following our curve and the curve value of factor. So we're using a curve to accelerate the health regen over time. So in this case, I've got 2 and this curve, and you see here this preview at 0 is 2. And if I slide this across, you'll see preview at 1, it's 6. And preview at 2, it's 18, 33, and 48, etc. So by using a curve, you can multiply the value against your curve, and we do the same thing on our periodicity, right? So we're ticking every half second, but we're multiplying it by our frequency curve, which means that our ticking is going to get tighter and tighter and tighter as time goes on. So after 3 seconds, we're taking every 0.07. After 4 seconds, it's 0.05. So the curve, we have 2 variables in this curve. So if we look at this curve table, we have our factor, which is scaling along this curve. And we have our frequency, which is scaling along this curve. And so those 2 curves are used in the effect to speed up and increase the overall health. So now let's look at the actual ability. The ability activates. We use an internal variable called inLoop, and I'll explain why that in a minute. We listen for any damage being taken. So the Lyra damage system will broadcast this damage taken message anytime someone takes damage. So that's kind of our trigger. We wait for that message to be received. If that message is received, we need to check that it's us, because this fires for all actors, not just our own actor. So we make sure it's us. If it is us, then we receive some damage, and we can start the countdown to see if we don't take any more damage. So the idea here is your time out of combat upon taking damage is set to 0. and it will attempt to achieve your total time, but anytime you take damage, it'll get reset back to 0. So if we take damage a second time, we go back to 0, we stop healing, and we enter this loop if we weren't already in it. And the reason we had to gate the loop is the way asynchronous tasks work is if I throw out there an asynchronous task like a wait, and I then come around and I send another wait, I now have 2 waits running in parallel. And so the way to avoid that is to make sure I only ever have 1 wait task in queue, and therefore I'm gating the re-entry and the reissuing of the delay. So we wait for 1 cycle, which is 1 second. When that second is over, we update our time out of combat as what the original time out of combat was, how long we've waited. We're just printing a message to the screen there. We're checking, have we been out of combat greater than our target? If we have, we break out of our loop and we issue our healing effect. So we basically trigger that gameplay ability to heal that we just talked about. If we aren't out of combat long enough, we're basically going to loop back and wait another cycle. So the overall flow is fairly simple. We basically initiate, listen for the damage message, and then loop until such a time as we have been out of combat long enough to trigger the heal ability. So hopefully that makes sense. The other abilities, so let's look at very quickly what the other ability looks like. They're not that different. So the skill 4, which is the first one that grants an ability. Skill 4, let's get the item up here first. The item for skills for skill 4. Skill 4, which is the meteor ability, has a point cost of 1. It has a prerequisite that skill 2 has to have been unlocked. It will give the player the gameplay effect skill 4. In this case, it doesn't modify the player other than the tag for removal. And then it will grant this item. So it basically does exactly what the initial item definition does, is it gives the player a new item in their inventory. And then there's our removal tag. So how that manifests in game is if I grant skill 2, skill 4 opens up, the meteor strike, I spend a skill point there, I have that skill. I'm actually going to give myself a few more skill points so I can unlock my out of combat health and my burst. And then I'm going to go make sure I don't die. Should be far enough away. So I've unlocked these skills. The last 2 I unlocked gave me new abilities, which are here on my abilities tab. And you'll see here on my abilities tab that I have 2 abilities, and I can choose to slot them in any of my ability slots. If I go back to my skills and I do a skill reset, then these all go back to being off. This is the only one I can activate because these have prerequisites. My ability, I don't have any abilities right now. So back into skills. This unlocks the 2. This unlocks that one. This unlocks. This unlocks. This unlocks. And if I wanted to give myself some more points, now I can unlock this one. I go to my abilities. I drag meteor into slot 1. And I'll drag burst into slot 2. And then now I have the 2 abilities. So I can attempt to eradicate my foe. And then if I were to reset my skills again, you'll note that the abilities will disappear in the bottom right, and the abilities are gone from the known abilities view. So a little example of sort of a player skill ability. You could have a tab for stats. You could have a tab for equipment. Basically, this allows you to drive your skill tree, which then can unlock new abilities, which then give you the option to slot those abilities into your active slots. And then just to round it out for our inventory, we've now removed both the skills and the abilities from our default inventory because we really don't want to see those, right? We want to see resources, we want to see equipment, we want to see crafting, we want to see building components, and we want to see currencies. Notes that the skill point does not show up because it's hidden in game. All right, I think that's enough for a quick overview. If you've got questions or comments, go ahead and leave a comment. We'll maybe explore with some supplementals some of the code around some of the other elements. But again, I think that gives you enough of the design concepts to build out your own systems and capabilities based on Lyra. So thanks for watching. We're super excited because in our next chapter, we're going to start the persistence layer, which is where everything hangs together between sessions, and then we're able to log off and log back on and basically maintain our state through sessions. So thanks for watching.